Today is a very special day. It's the 22nd of June, the anniversary of the Nazi Germany invading the USSR. And in every family, there is a story, and most of the stories are tragic. There are some comical stories. There are all kind of history connected with this day. Alexander Etkind, in his book Warped Grief, writes about the first generation generally being silent about trauma, and only by the third generation there is a potential to be able to process or speak about the trauma. However, today we are going to look at the people who were able to speak at the time when the tragedy was happening. And from here, I will pass the word to the moderator of the panel, Boris Dralyuk, who is the executive editor of the Los Angeles Review of Books. He is the co-editor with Robert Chandler and Irina Mashinski, who are also joining us today, of the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, and editor of 1917 Stories and Poems from the Russian Revolution and 10 Poems from Russia, and the translator of many works of literature from Russian into English. His poems have appeared in the New Criterion, the Yale Review, Jewish Quarterly, and elsewhere. The editor of the anthology that we are going to look at today is Maria Bloshteyn, and Boris is going to introduce Maria and other participants. I'm just going to end this introduction by recommending Globus Books, which is a physical store in San Francisco, and we're a unique store that has been around from 1971 and that carries great collection of books on all subjects connected with the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. We also recently started this literary translation roundtable, and we have a lot of events already shared on our YouTube channel. Check it out. And we have a great schedule of events coming all up until November. So check our website for more great talks in making. And from here, Boris, would you like to take the word?
Thank you very much, Zarina. Thank you for having us and for inviting us to participate in this event. And yes, Globus is a wonderful store, a physical store, but it's also a global store. And now we are joined by people and can be joined by people from all across the world. So let me introduce our panelists today. As Adina so eloquently said, the reason for our gathering here is to present a really an extraordinary volume called Russia is Burning. And the compiler of that volume, as well as the translator of most of the poems in a very thick anthology, is Maria Bloshteyn, who was born in Leningrad, what was then Leningrad, and emigrated to Canada when she was 9 years old. She holds a PhD from York University in Toronto and was a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University. Her research at the time was on Dostoevsky's impact on American literature and culture. And one of the remarkable things about Masha is how well she is able to integrate her knowledge of American culture and Anglophone culture and Russian culture, which is partly why she's such an able translator. Her publications include The Making of a Counterculture Icon, Henry Miller's Dostoevsky, and she is the translator of an excellent volume of Alexander Galich's work, Dress Rehearsal, and also of Anton Chekhov's The Prank, early stories from Chekhov's career, humorous stories. And many of her translations are featured in the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry, which has already been mentioned. The guiding spirit behind the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry is Robert Chandler, who is probably of all of us needs the least introduction. He is one of the foremost translators of Russian literature, not just working today, but I think in the English tradition. He has introduced the English-speaking world, really introduced the English-speaking world to the work of Teffy, a great writer of the early 20th century, as well as reintroduced the English world in a proper fashion to Andrei Platonov and to Vasily Grossman. And these three authors alone should earn Robert a statue that no one should topple. There's also three anthologies of classics that Robert has spearheaded. One of them is of Russian short stories, another of Russian folk tales. The third is the volume of Russian poetry that I co-edited with Robert and with Adina Machine Ski, our next guest of honor. Adina Machine Ski is a brilliant Russian-American poet currently based in New Jersey, but born and raised in Moscow. She has just completed work on a remarkable memoir and meditation with verse that draws on her experiences both in Moscow and in the United States. And I very much hope that that will soon be published. But she is the author of 10 books of poetry in Russian, so you can read her right away. You don't have to wait for that book. And as also the founder and the chief editor of Cardinal Points, a journal of Slavic literature and translation that is now published annually in print. And her work has appeared in periodicals on both sides of every ocean. And right now, what I'll do is I'll begin by asking Masha to tell us a little bit more about the reason that we have come here. There's no better date to speak about this book, Russia is Burning. So maybe Masha can introduce the book and tell us about its origins.
Sure. So I'd like to start first by saying how I connected to you and Robert and Irina, and how I really saw the extraordinary work that you're doing and how I was inspired by it. So I was asked 7 years ago, like hard to even imagine, but it was 7 years ago. I was asked in my capacity as a literary scholar, more appropriately like a student, eternal student of literature, I was asked to talk about Vasily Grossman's life and fate. I read Grossman in Russian. I didn't really know too much about the publication history or the translation history. I was given a book and said, here, please speak about it. So I was looking through the translation, and it was extraordinary. It was very accurate, but more than that, it was very true to all the registers of Grossman's speech and style, and got everything just so. But I was looking through it and I was thinking, okay, well, here's Life and Fate. Where's the first part? Zapravé Delо, where is it? So, and I couldn't understand why it hadn't been translated yet. And I thought, well, why don't I go find the translator who behind this extraordinary translation, and find out why. So that's how I searched out Robert. And we had a very interesting conversation, and he told me a lot about how, books published in the Soviet era were perceived, and why certain books were, there was more demand for some books, less of demand for other books. And I'm happy to say, by the way, that Zapravé Delо has been translated beautifully by Robert and Elizabeth. It's been published as Stalingrad. It's available, part one, for those of us who, the Anglophones who read Life and Fate and who wants to know what happened in part one, it's actually available for all of you. Go and get it. So, but it somehow came out, I think I mentioned that I translated Gulag. Now that was just the one-off thing. It was based on some work I did in undergrad. And I wanted, I wanted to bring out this Gulag book, and I did, and there were some poems in there. And Robert said, well, I'm working on this anthology of Russian poetry with two colleagues, with Boris Dralyuk and Irina Machine Ski. And could we take a look? I was, sort of very flattered, but sort of apprehensive. And I emailed the poems, my translations. And after a while, Robert got back to me and said, we like them. And I just couldn't believe, my luck. And, I was thrilled. And the best part about it is that I got to, this magic portal was open for me. And I saw the three of you working on this amazing, amazing anthology, which of course became the Penguin Book of Russian Poetry. And it was a master, I don't know what can be beyond master classes, but it was like the master class to end all master classes of translation. There would be this translation that I thought was, it was good, it was decent. And then Irina would come in with some insights onto like the meanings. And then there would be like this flurry of variations from you and Robert and Irina. And there were emails back and forth, and it was magic. And then at the end of it, there would be this stunning, incredible translation, which of course went all into this book. And this for me is, I think it really changed my perception of what anthologies, poetry anthologies could be. So it's both, for me, this is both iconic and iconoclastic, because not only does it do what all anthologies are supposed to do, which is to give you a really good sense of, the poetry of a nation, all these with introductions and with notes and with, and the translations are all fantastic, and you really, really understand Russian poetry by the end of it. Not only that, but at the very end, and this is what sort of blew me away as I looking through your book, there is, of course, the 4 poems by non-Russians. Now, who does that for an anthology of Russian poetry? But of course, it's brilliant. Like it breaks the mold, and it's brilliant because it allows you to really understand how you can access this, your own path into the material. So I was very, very inspired by it. And somewhere, like I was watching you guys work, and somewhere at some point, the publisher of Smokestack Books, Andy Croft, who I think Robert will be talking about later, I'll just say two words. He's this extraordinary man who is both a poet and a scholar and a biographer, most recently of Randall Swingler. And he's a one-man publishing extravaganza. He publishes these books of poetry, including now some Russian poetry. And he reached out to Robert, asking him whether Robert would like to translate a selection of Russian poems about the war. And Robert was very busy. He had other projects going. And so he asked me. And I was thrilled, right? I didn't realize what I was getting into, but I was very excited. I thought, yes, of course, Russian poetry of the war. It's a subject so close to me because, of course, my father fought in the war. Both of my grandfathers fought in the war. Of course, I want to do this. And then certain things happened. I put it off, and I dragged it out. And Andy was very sympathetic. He said, yes, it's okay, just take your time. And during all this time, I was doing research. And very quickly it became apparent that, I wanted to do something bigger than just a selection. So there was a lot of material. In fact, I was shocked at how much there was and how different it was from what I expected. And so it took about 5 years. I think he originally wanted it to be available for the 70th anniversary, right, of victory over Nazi Germany. And it took about 5 years of research and working. And of course, getting feedback and getting support and help from the 3 of you throughout. I think the best parts of my translations are actually your translations. The best lines are definitely yours. So after 5 years, the book is ready, and it's, it went to the printers, warts and all. So it's a very, very exciting time for me, and because it's very meaningful, and I'm very proud to be, hopefully following the footsteps of my 3 heroes who are behind this and behind so much more. So that's a very long answer to your short question.
Not very long at all. That was it was chock full of information. And what you say about the delay in the publication, of course, it's no delay. If it took 5 years, it took 5 years. That's how long it takes. But it's also, I think, fortuitous, because now the book appears alongside 2 other important publications that are linked to it organically by subject matter, and I think by the quality of execution. And I'll ask Robert to speak about Smokestack and its trio of offerings that have come at just the right time.
So I knew very little about Andy Croft and Smokestack until I was till I was working on the anthology, the Penguin anthology. And at some point, I must have just ordered in a slightly random way, a copy of a little book of poetry written by him and 2 of his friends about the Moscow Metro. And this was his poem about the Moscow Metro was absolutely brilliant. It was witty, showed enormous historical and cultural understanding, and I was quite entranced. And that was one of the 4 poems, the 4 English poems that, as Marcia's just said, we included at the end of our Penguin anthology. And so I corresponded with Andy just very occasionally over the years, and then a great deal more in the last 7 or 8 months. And Smokestack, his publishers, his publishing house in the north of England, they've bringing out 3 remarkable books this year. The first of them, which is already out, is a very good translation by James Womack of Twardowski's humorous, epic poem about the Second World War, about a sort of Soviet, a Red Army everyman, Vasily Tyorkin, who somehow survives and somehow gets out of every scrape. It's a very lively, entertaining poem. It's remarkably free of any propaganda, hardly any references to the Communist Party or Stalin, but it was hugely, hugely popular at the time and afterwards. And people have, it's hard to measure these things, but it has been seriously said by knowledgeable people that it really made a difference to the morale of the Red Army. Soldiers really were overjoyed to find sort of someone showing an understanding of their lives. And James Womack's translation is it's just very, very easy to read. It's in lively rhythm. It just makes you want to go on reading. There are none of the sort of strained rhymes or syntactic awkwardness that are off-putting in so many translations from Russian. So that's already out. The other book by an individual poet, Simonov, will be out in October. They're lyric poems, many of them love poems. The title is Wait for Me. So it's a soldier asking his woman to wait for him. These two were hugely popular at the time in a way that it's hard for English and American speakers to imagine. And they're beautiful translations, one or two of which we included in our Penguin anthology. And then Amasha's own book, which is huge in comparison with the other two. They're all bilingual. She includes an enormous range of voices, including Twardowski and Simonov, but also poems written by émigrés, poems written by Gulag inmates. There's one poem at least written by someone who collaborated with the occupying Nazis. These kind of things haven't been done before. Russian feelings about the war are so strong that it's considered unacceptable to include poems that are kind of cynical, or certainly a poem by someone who collaborated. So there's a vast range to this book. As a kind of bridge between the various books, I've been doing what I can to draw attention to these books, because it's difficult for a small publisher in the north of England to get distribution or any attention for his books. I will be publishing a review myself, but I've been putting the odd thing up on Facebook, and there's one poem which got quite a lot of response, very pleasing response from people who look at my Facebook page. So I'm just going to have a sip of tea and then I shall read it. One other important feature of Marsha's book is very, very informative and sometimes moving little introductory notes, 4 or 5 lines. So I shall start with that. So this is Twardowski, who, this is a kind of prelude in a way to the anthology. So Twardowski was a war correspondent during the Winter War with Finland, shortly before the Second World War. This so-called minor war, the ethics of which were privately questioned by many, resulted in more than 120,000 Soviet dead. In his diaries, Twardowski reflected with shock about how quickly the individual dead are forgotten in a war. poem is called 2 Lines. Found in my tattered notepad 2 lines about a soldier lad killed back in Finland, whom I saw in 1940 in the snow. He looked so awkward as he lay, small as a child on that cold day. His overcoat was frozen stiff. His cap had rolled so far away. It seemed as if he wasn't done. It looked like he was running on, only the ice had held him down. Amid this big and ruthless war, I cannot say exactly why I feel such pity for this lad, as if he's showing me my fate, as if I am the one who lies small, frozen solid, downed during that war of no renown, forgotten on the ice. So that was a poem written in 1943 amid this big and ruthless war. It's very simple, it says a great deal, and it's so sort of naturally translated that one doesn't immediately think, oh, what's what virtuoso translation. And it wasn't really until looking at today and thinking about this talk that I sort of gave conscious thought to the rhyming of it, and just how wonderfully it's done, rhyming on such simple words that they're the most important words, but they're such simple words that you don't sort of give a lot of thought to the fact that the rhyme words. It seemed he was done, but only the ice had held him down, as if I am the one who lies small, frozen, solid, downed during that war of no renown. So completely natural. They're words that you'd feel would belong there, even if there wasn't any need for a rhyme, and they just work perfectly. And that kind of thing is just it's such a joy to encounter that in translations, because so often in translations, above all, and especially a lot of translators make a fetish of that sort of every if a Russian poem is all in perfect rhyme, then the English poem has to be all in perfect rhyme as well, even though our rhyming traditions are very different. So one so often in translations of poetry comes across rhyme words which just shouldn't be there. They're not natural to the meaning at all. Either the wrong word is being emphasized, or it's just simply the wrong word, or whatever. So great to read that. And I think just the one other thing I would like to say is I've already said how informative Masha's notes are. There are occasions where, this isn't true obviously of every poet, but there are some occasions where the note is just such a telling and moving little story that the poem doesn't really say any more than the Masha's note has done. So a poet I hadn't known before called Nikolai Puchenko, the 4-line note. Puchenko was arrested while in hospital due to machine gun wounds to both legs. The reason for his arrest was that he added up the figures of enemy dead provided by Pravda and exclaimed, "So who are we fighting with if all the Nazis have been killed?" He was taken to prison directly from the hospital bed and tortured before being sent to the Gulag. There is such a vast amount of history condensed into those few lines. I mean, it's so condensed that to someone unfamiliar with Soviet history, it may even be a bit hard to grasp that he's just added up these vastly exaggerated figures of enemy dead from the official Soviet newspaper and worked out that there's couldn't be any Nazi soldiers left if these figures are true. So things like that are a very, very important part of the anthology. So I think that's enough from me at the moment.
Thank you,
Yeah, so thank you very much, Marcia, for this wonderful anthology, which has introduced me to a huge number of poets that I had not known even their names beforehand. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, and thank you for all your help, and for Boris's and for Irina's. It wouldn't have been possible at all if not for your constant support. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robert, for that very eloquent tribute to brilliant poems, brilliantly translated. Masha, maybe you can develop on Robert's response and tell us about some of the discoveries that have stuck with you. The book is full of discoveries, like that 4-line note that Robert just cited. What has really, what impacted you? What were the moments that made you pause and that have remained in your memory?
So I think the first big moment that I had, the one that was like an epiphany, was when I was doing the research on the book. And here I was thinking, I know the field pretty well. I mean, I was raised on this stuff, wasn't I? And, here's our home library, all the books that we brought, in 1970. Sorry, I'm not showing it the right way. I was raised on this. What I know stuff inside out. There's Simonov, there's Svitlov, all the big hits. I've got all of them. And so at a certain point, I realized that, oh my goodness, there is not only is this not all, but this isn't even the tip of the iceberg, that there is this extraordinary body of poetry, all written about the war, sometimes very often during the war, that I really had no idea about. And that never makes it into either, these Soviet ones, these Soviet editions, for understandable reasons, or post-Soviet ones either. And the reason for that, I think, first of all, why it hasn't been done, I mean, think about it, it's 75 years of anthologies, right? The first anthology started coming out during the war, right? Poets fighting poets, poets who were war correspondents. All of this poetry was being compiled already then. There was a huge demand. And so there's 75 years of war poetry being put into anthologies, both before the Soviet Union fell and then after the Soviet Union fell. But there's still such a, you look at the language, the introduction of the editors to these anthologies, and the recent one as well. And it's all couched in this language of an offering. This is our debt to our fallen heroes. This is our debt to that generation who suffered so much. This is the least that we could do. We could compile these poems and we can present them as our, as evidence that we remember and we love and we honor and we respect. So once you're going to do that, you're getting into this whole, almost biblical idea of a perfect offering. It can't be blighted in any way. You can't have a poet who, for instance, there's this one particular poet, he didn't make it into my anthology either, unfortunately, but he was a hero of the Civil War, and then he was shell-shocked. During the first days, he was in a bomb train. The train was bombed. He wasn't wounded. He wasn't hurt. He was shell-shocked, and he ended up in Tashkent. And he wrote poems about experience, and they're quite extraordinary poems about what it was like during the war in Tashkent. But he was a coward. He was. It's somehow, you can't include a poem of his, even though he was a Soviet poet, even though he never got in trouble with the Soviet government, which was the main reason why poets didn't make it into Soviet era anthologies. But he was just not, he wasn't on that standard. He wasn't a perfect offering. So when I found out that there are these countless poets who were in the Gulag, they were interned in the Gulag for various reasons. Like, some of them were infiltration camps, which are, of course, what was done to soldiers who were captured by the enemy and they were then released, and then rearrested sometimes sent straight to the Gulag. And they all wrote about their experience. And then there was émigré literature, émigré poets who also wrote about what it felt like, to be witnessing what was going on. They're also part of this experience. They're also part of Russian poetry. And of course, for them, we're so fixated. And I know that I was fixated on the date, today's date as well, 22 июня, ровно в 4 часа Киев бомбили, нам объявили, что началась война, right? Like of course, World War, it began on June the 22nd. Well, 1941. Well, no, it began in 1939. And these Russian émigré poets who were living in Paris at the time, in France, who were living in China, who were living in all these places, they actually felt the impact of the war in 39. They started to write about it. And that's also part of the, part of the legacy, and certainly part of this canon. I realized how narrow the selection and the range of poems were given, from childhood in my case. And I think that was the biggest realization. And after that, almost everything was a discovery. One poet that comes to mind was Ian Degan. So he was a tank man during the war, and he wrote these extraordinary poems that were not published, but they were very well known. They're sort of part of the oral folklore, which is another part we don't really talk about. We don't see these poems that the soldiers themselves recited just for their own, not in meetings, but just for their own benefit, for their own enjoyment, for their own sort of, they're fighting poems and songs that were reflecting their own experience, that were not exactly part of the official canon. And so I was researching Ian Degan, and it turned out that when Yevtushenko, Ian Degan survived, he made it through the war, he became a surgeon, he lived in Israel, and he was visited there by Yevtushenko. And Yevtushenko, they're talking, and Yevtushenko asked Degan, who is your favorite war poet? And he named a poet that I've never heard, and that Yevtushenko also never heard of, apparently, at the time. And that is Nikolai Puchenko. So Nikolai Puchenko is really this extraordinary man, and I've included 2 of his poems in the anthology. He was from Kaluga. He was actually from there. And we know that it was a very important town for dissidents and for writers and for poets, for artists later on. So he was from Kaluga. He was in the Air Force. He ended up contused. He was seriously wounded. He came back to Kaluga and he finished the local teachers' college. And that's the other thing. It was hard when I was working on it. It seemed like the lives of these poets during the war was so self-sufficient. It was kind of hard to remember that they're all so young and that they had a whole life ahead of them, So he arrived to Kaluga, he went to teachers college, he became a journalist, and he was the main editor for this local newspaper, Young Leninist. It was a Komsomol newspaper. He was the one who discovered and nurtured Bulata Kojava. So Bulata Kojava said that he wouldn't be who he was, he wouldn't have this extraordinary career, he wouldn't be able to write everything that he wrote if not for Puchenko's support during those years. So Puchenko wrote poetry during the war. Some of it was published actually in army newspapers, of which there were a host. It's hard to imagine what a demand there was for poetry and how many venues there were requiring, like mandating poets, just write, we want your stuff. So he wrote for that. He wrote some poems for the desk door during the war. I have one of them in the anthology. It's a poem about how a soldier realizes that he lost a lot of himself, the fighting and the killing. He lost his heart during the war. And he writes about the trauma of that. So I have that poem. And then after the war, he is in Kaluga. he puts together this extraordinary thing called the the Tarusa Almanac, Taruski Stranice. And in it, he has, these poems by Noam Karjavin and by Slutsky and by Tsvetaeva and by Samoilov and all these people. The idea was he was going to publish, it was a thaw, like 1961, 1960, you could get away with a lot of stuff. The censorship was kind of being lifted, at least a lot of people felt that. And so the idea was he would publish everything that was not being accepted by the main newspapers and the main journals. And it was going to be, it was going to go through local censorship. There was a man who was willing to take care of it. It didn't have to go to Moscow. And so, so Puchenko published a series of poems, which he called Obelisk, the obelisk, about war. 1960, in that first edition, the first issue, I should say, the only issue of this almanac. And in it, he had this poem. So there are 9 poems, and one of them is about a rape of a woman. And it's not by Nazi soldiers, which is the only way you'd really read about rape of women during the war, right? In Soviet poetry. It was always like Semenov, kill him, right? There was a whole section there about how the beloved gets raped by the Nazi soldiers. Well, this woman doesn't get raped by Nazi soldiers. She gets raped by, fellow Slavs, the Vlasovites, okay? But still not the demonized Nazis. And he was criticized for this poem. He never republished it. Needless to say, the almanac, going above Moscow's head for censorship, like not going to Moscow for censorship, I meant to say, was not accepted. And the almanac was closed down. And that was the last time he published that poem during his lifetime. But I thought it was extraordinary and deserved being included. So that was one of my discoveries, and one of many, because as I said, it turned out I really knew just the tip of the iceberg of this vast literature that was written about the war.
That's right. Well, so it seems that your mission was twofold. You were not only correcting the record that already existed in the Russian tradition, because there was a very sizable record, but as you say, it had blind spots. Vast swaths of poetry were excluded. But you're also introducing World War II poetry from Russia for the first time to many Anglophone readers. So not only these poets that you've rediscovered, but also major poets that virtually all Russian readers recognize as being major, but that don't really exist for Russian readers quite yet, for Anglophone readers quite yet. And I thought we should spend a little bit of time on 2 of these major figures of 20th century Russian poetry who deserve a lot of support still, and haven't fully made it into readers' minds. So those 2 poets are Slutsky and Tarkovsky. And I'll ask Robert maybe to say a few words about what makes Slutsky's poetry special and what makes it so difficult to translate. And if anyone else would like to chime in on that, that would be great as well. And after that, I'll ask Irina to talk about Tarkovsky.
So Slutsky is, I think, the first of the Russian war poets who I really got to know. We gave him quite a lot of space in our Penguin anthology. He's a very intelligent poet, a very thoughtful poet. He greatly admired Brecht, and there's a similar note, a sort of tough, intelligent, no-nonsense stoicism in both poets. Not all his poetry is difficult to translate, because, which is one reason for including quite a lot of it in our anthology. Poetry that really, has good, original, interesting thoughts is easier to translate, because thoughts are easier to translate than music. So just a few lines to give you a flavour of Slutsky's intelligent bleakness at times. He's not always bleak, but quite often he is. So this is a poem about German prisoners of war, and it ends with the lines, "Sooner or later, every post-war period becomes a pre-war period. The outcome of the Sixth World War will depend on how we have treated the prisoners of war from the Fifth." So it's a thoughtful poem. It's even a wise poem. When a colleague in Petersburg was asking me to contribute to a sort of book of conference proceedings with the title of Victory, I asked her to include that, which she did. A very, very kind of thoughtful, wise response to victory. Slutsky himself said of his poems, he was a wonderful little passage. This is Slutsky about his own war poems. "The life that I lived for 4 years was brutal and tragic, and it seemed one needed to write tragedies about it. But since I was unable to write true tragedies, I wrote ballads, shortened, crumpled, and concise tragedies." And I love that, crumpled and concise tragedies. Just touched on the theme of ballads. The Puchenko poem that Masha has just mentioned, which she translates the title as "A Ballad About a Heart Shot to Bits." Again, there's this quality of real sort of realistic thought about, in this case, the difficulties of going back to a peacetime world. It's a similar theme to one of Platonov's greatest works, The Return, which is a short story about an army captain's rather difficult return to his family in 1945, late 45. So I'd like to just read a little bit of Puchenko, which I think, I have no idea whether Slutsky knew anything about him, but I think Slutsky would have admired it. So early, I won't read all of the poem, which is quite long, but it includes the lines, "The bullets looked and looked for my heart, but couldn't find it to blow it apart. I got the orders, I knew the score, no heart was needed in the war." And then a bit later, "But where will I find a heart later when my soldier's job is done? I'll be a misfit for a long, long time, begging for heart as a handout. Give to a war cripple, spare some heart. I saved the land, I did my part. I'll wander like a living crucifix, my plea turned to a prayer on my lips. Spare some heart, I'll shout into doorways. Spare some heart, I'll bang with my fist. Don't you see, a heartless man is more fearsome than any beast. And someone in a flat somewhere will tell me, this post-war world is mean and hard. Don't look for miracles, my dear. We all have a shortage of heart." So Boris asked me to speak about Slutsky, but that fits Slutsky's definition of crumpled, concise tragedies so beautifully. I couldn't resist reading that too. And all the same things. I think Marsha's translations are especially good when there's some element of song in them. It's where I first noticed her work, was her translations of Galitsch's songs, which are just a kind of an appendix to this prose memoir, which nobody seemed to have noticed. So I was very glad to be able to include them in our anthology. And somehow that sense of music, it actually always seems to clarify the diction as well. So the language is just absolutely simple and absolutely right all the way through. I think we should go on to Tarkovsky.
I agree. But I will just say that what you've done, moved from Slutsky to Puchenko, it's exactly what this anthology inspires us to do, to find echoes between these poets and to build conversations, even if those conversations didn't exist historically. It's really a thrill to read and to flip back and forth through the book. And now let's flip to Tarkovsky. Maybe Irina can tell us a little bit about his work.
Tarkovsky is, of course, one of the idols of my generation, and he is amazingly, he is certainly a very famous poet, and I don't think I need to say much. But he was born in 1907, and he survived he died in the late 80s, surviving his famous son, the filmmaker, Andrei Tarkovsky. Although he was recognized by the best of the best, right? Tsvetaeva and Akhmatova, and he was an amazing poet. He didn't publish his first collection until he was in the late 50s. I mean, it's not that, it was certainly was by his choice. So he had to be a translator, and he was an extraordinary translator for a long time, especially after the war. He was completely denied access to publications. But when Boris and I decided to translate one of his poems, A Field Hospital, that made it into a poem which made it into Masha's anthology. Of course, there were so many tasks that we needed to address. The most obvious one is that Tarkovsky's voice is so charismatic. It's so unmistakable. How do you translate the unmistakable? It's the most difficult thing. How do you translate the charismatic, the hypnotic tone, and this very airy Gestalt-like texture of every poem that is known to everyone who loves his poetry. And there was something different about this particular poem. It is, in a way, constructed, if you will, as a planetary model. It describes the narrator is in the hospital and is being operated on, and sees himself in the middle of the universe, or rather some kind of a planetary system that is very motionless for the large part of the poem, and then after a certain impetus it's just set in motion, and then this terrible warlike wartime destruction scene suddenly disappear, and is followed by this very different image of spring. The very important quality of Tarkovsky that is, at least to me, and I'm sure to Boris is also very important, that Tarkovsky is known for this persistent and recognized by ear immediately by this persistent lexicon. There are a few words that are so Tarkovskian, and they're very simple, but just, it's him. So we needed to translate this one separate poem as if we were translating the whole collection, and following this repeating persistent lexicon that would reappear in every piece that Tarkovsky creates. So these were some of the many challenges that we needed to face. I will read this. One of them, by the way, was a new word that is very Tarkovskian, but it doesn't exist. It's a non-existent word, Slепительного света. You will hear it when I read it in Russian. So we were, of course, tempted. We were tempted to create something that would be cool, that would be unusual, that would combine certain qualities of different words. For example, one of the candidates was glistening, that would combine glistening and blinding, right? So there were other words like dazzling, but they were too neon for Tarkovsky. Mm-hmm. And we needed to come up with something more subtle and yet memorable. And certainly we needed a memorable first line, because that is a must. So this is the poem, and Boris will read I will not torture you with the English reading. Boris will read our version. Полевой госпиталь. It's written in blank verse in the original. Полевой госпиталь. Стол повернули к свету. Я лежал вниз головой, как мясо на весах. Душа моя на нитке колотилась, и видел я себя со стороны. Я без довесков был уравновешен базарной жирной гирей. Это было посередине снежного щита, щербатого по западному краю, в кругу незамерзающих болот, деревьев с перебитыми ногами и железнодорожных полустанков с расколотыми черепами черных от снежных шапок, то двойных, а то тройных. В тот день остановилось время. Не шли часы, и души поездов по насыпям не пролетали больше без фонарей на серых ластах пара. И ни вороньих свадеб, ни метели, ни оттепели не было в том лимбе, где я лежал, в позоре, в наготе, в крови своей, вне поля тяготения грядущего. Но сдвинулся и на оси пошел по кругу щит слепительного снега, и низко у меня над головой семерка самолетов развернулась, и марли, как древесная кора, на теле затвердела, и бежала чужая кровь из колбы в жилы мне, и я дышал, как рыба на песке, глотая твердый, слюдяной, земной, холодный и благословенный воздух. Мне губы обметало, и еще меня поили с ложки, и еще не мог я вспомнить, как меня зовут, но ожил у меня на языке словарь царя Давида. А потом и снег сошел, и ранняя весна на цыпочки привстала, и деревья окутала своим платком зеленым. Even if you don't speak Russian, you hear this abundant, this swishing sound that is rather rare in Russian poems that we also needed to preserve. And of course, all these endings, they're there for a reason. So we couldn't allow for enjambments to move, for the stanzaic breaks to move. We needed to preserve a lot. And but that was the beauty of it all. And of course, when you read the poem that you need to translate, you read it differently. Mm-hmm. You see it differently, and that's a gift in itself. So I think that's very cool.
I will say that I don't think anyone reads Russian poetry as forcefully and as expressively as Irina. She is really a remarkable reader, and it's a great pleasure to hear you.
May I just add something before we move to this, because it's interesting in terms of the vowels of the sound, that this poem is really quite different from many poems that Tarkovsky wrote, because in many of his poems, the vowels very often are, because it's a Moscow sound, ah. Тогда еще не воевали с Германией, 13-й год был еще впереди. Or и, like, вьюгу на латынь переводила виде, я пил степную синь. So one can translate that just, forcing some certain tweak, using this as a tool, but here we didn't have this opportunity.
So here is our English field hospital. They turned the table to the light. I lay upside down like meat slapped onto a scale. My soul swayed, dangling on a string. I saw myself from the side. balanced without make-weights against a fat mass from the market. This was in the middle of a snow shield, chipped along its western edge, surrounded by icy swamps, by trees on broken legs, and railroad hulks with their skulls cracked open, looking black beneath their snowy caps, some double and some triple. Time stopped that day. Clocks didn't run. The souls of trains no longer flew along the mounds, lightless, ungrizzled fins of steam. No gatherings of crows, no blizzards, no thaws in that limbo where I lay naked in disgrace in my own blood, outside the pull of future's gravity. But then it shifted, circling on its axis, the shield of blinding snow. A wedge of 7 airplanes turned low above me, and the gauze, like tree bark, stiffened on my body, while someone else's blood now ran into my veins out of a flask, and I breathed like a fish tossed on the sand, gulping the hard, earthy, mica-like, cold, and blessed air. My lips were chapped, and then they fed me with a spoon, and then I couldn't recall my name, while King David's lexicon awoke upon my tongue. Then snow melted away, and early spring stood on her toes and wrapped the trees with her green kerchief. Yes, I was actually thinking that we didn't share a poem by Degen, and I would love to hear Masha read that very short and powerful poem.
In both languages.
Yes.
In both languages.
I apologize in advance. Okay, I think everyone knows that Robert, Irina, and Boris are poets. I'm not a poet. I am very upfront with that, and I can't read poetry as beautifully. But I will read it for you, and read for you in both languages. So one thing you should know about it. Here's one interesting bit about the poem. It was very well known. It was not published. It was not published in any sort of official journals or newspapers or what have you during the war. It was extremely well known, and people knew it by heart. And when Yevtushenko published this poem in his famous anthology, he got several lines wrong. And Ian Lazarevich Degin, who passed away only about 3 years ago, was furious. So, and he also, Yevtushenko also got his name wrong, his given name. So he was not happy about that either. So in this anthology, I'm happy to say, we have his name, the patronymic, the last name correct, and the poem is exactly the way he wanted it. So here it is. Мой товарищ, в смертельной агонии не зови понапрасну друзей. Дай-ка лучше согрею ладони я над дымящейся кровью твоей. Ты не плачь, не стани, ты не маленький. Ты не ранен, ты просто убит. Дай на память сниму с тебя валенки, нам еще наступать предстоит. Декабрь 1944 года. And here's the translation, which was tweaked by Robert, and I'm forever grateful. My comrade, in your final agony, don't bother calling to friends. Better that your steaming blood should warm my freezing hands. Don't cry and moan, you're not a child, you're not wounded, you're merely shot dead. I'll take your boots to remember you by. There's still lots of fighting ahead. December 1944.
Anyone who can translate that like that is a poet. I just hope you know that, Masha.
I had poets' help.
And to think that he was 19 years old when he wrote this, yes?
He's very young, yes.
Yeah. Remarkable. People were forced to grow up very quickly, and some were stunted in their development. So I think maybe this is a good time, if anyone has any questions in the audience, we can open up the discussion.
We do have some questions that are coming from our YouTube audience, and thank you everyone watching us on YouTube. So somebody wrote in Russian, Maria is saying, what a wonderful reading of Tarkovsky's poetry. Thank you, and I hope to familiarize my students with this and other poems that you have translated carefully. Thank you for your work, and that's wonderful. And the question from John is probably for Masha. How did you find the World War II Army papers? And another question from John as well. How do you find the context for the change in meaning over time?
Mm-hmm.
And that's probably for everyone.
First of all, as I said, there are tons of anthologies. This is such a painful topic, but so important to so many families. As Irina said in the very beginning, everyone has their own stories, and everyone has their connection that they want to preserve somehow. And one way of preserving it is through poetry and through reading poetry. So there are tons of anthologies. So when it comes to the big names, you know, the greatest hits, they've all been published, they've all been anthologized. And it was, you know, I tried to make sure that the Anglophone reader would also have a good understanding of what they were, you know, the biggest hits, you know, the Soviet, the Russian poetry that everyone was listening to and reading and making into songs as well. So now everything else, at one point, I really felt that it was important to include some of the unofficial sort of folklore, some of the songs that people were singing that were not, you know, given to them officially, some of the songs that they're making up. So there I had to go to post-Soviet publications, like on folklore, because they weren't really gathered. People weren't really interested after the war, throughout or during the war. They're interested, the folklorists who are out in full force collecting material, they're interested in chastushki and kind of very pro-Soviet things. And they weren't interested in satirical songs, which also existed and which I really wanted to get at least one. So there I had to go to the journals, post-Soviet journals and articles. And then when it came to émigré writers, there are a lot of chapbooks and a lot of émigré publications. They're actually quite extraordinarily the second wave of immigration, which included some extraordinary poets. Olga Anstey, Ivan Yelagin, Maurice, all these people, they actually started to publish their publish their poems in displaced persons camps. So they're leading this very precarious existence. They could have been picked up and taken back to the Soviet Union, where they knew very well what would happen to them. And yet they were trying to publish on these, you know, on cheap paper. In exchange, you wouldn't actually buy these editions, you'd exchange them for coffee or cigarettes. But they managed to do it. So there's stuff aplenty. Also, there are lots of anthologies of Gulag poetry, some of which is connected to the war. So basically, I went through a whole bunch of sources to find it. And then as to the second question, how did everything change? So the biggest change, of course, came with the fall of the Soviet Union. And the poets who were thinking about it, some of whom went through the war, they're really reassessing what happened in light of new information that was coming out and new information about how the war was being fought. And there is a lot of, there are many attempts after the fall of the Soviet Union to look at Nazi Germany and Soviet Union and see what the similarities were, and sort of to become, you know, to abstract themselves from the war and to see it from the side, you know, with all the new information that was coming out. Mm-hmm. So I think that would be the biggest change, you know, time after the war, after the Soviet Union fell apart, 1990s. There was also a huge, during perestroika and glasnost, where you could finally publish what people were writing for the desk, you know, for the desk table. There was a whole deluge of material that was coming out. I think maybe too big a deluge for it to be properly absorbed. All these poets, all these poems, hundreds of that, like unbelievable, the quantities that were coming out. I think we're still processing them. And by the way, a lot of the poems haven't been published yet. So there are a number of poets whose legacies are still, you know, largely, you know, in boxes. I haven't been brought out. So hopefully, you know, they're being published slowly now.
Yes.
Thank you. This is great to understand the whole work that you've done. It's not just translation. It's really finding, compiling, archiving, and preserving it. And thank you for doing this and also telling us about it. There's a very simple question, logistics, which I think would be good for everyone to hear the answer. Is the book bilingual or just in English?
It's bilingual.
Great.
I should also say there are 3 sections to the book. Voices Heard, which is, the greatest hits. And just, I should say also, I was focusing on my father, who was a young man fighting during the time. And my big question was, what did he hear as he was fighting on the front? So those are Voices Heard, which includes like the greatest hits, and then some of the sort of poems that were not published, but everyone knew, a couple of songs that everyone was singing that weren't the official songs, the so-called trench songs. Then there's a second section, which is called Muted Voices, which really is probably the more controversial one. And it has the émigrés, and it has the Gulag, and it has, all the people who are writing for the desk drawer, and hoping that one day they could publish it. And then the third section is called Remembering the War. And that is after the war, some of the people were, who were fighting, who were still working through the experience. It took them their entire lives, really. And I'm not going to suggest that, somehow they figured out everything by, their old age. They're still writing about the war and still troubled by it. It still informed their lives. The trauma, as you said at the beginning, Zarina, the trauma goes from generation to generation. I find it shocking that I'm generation 1 after the war. Just shocking. My kids are just second generation, So yeah, so that's the division. And yes, everything is bilingual, although the notes are all in English. And the essay, there's an essay at the end that talks about, history and the culture, and, it's also in English.
Yes. And I see that there's another question after that about annotations. And I should just say that this is one of the best annotated anthologies I've ever seen. It doesn't look like a scholarly edition in that there aren't footnotes cluttering the text or anything of that kind. What Masha has done instead is incorporate all of that vital information into head notes for each of the poets and poems, as well as into essays, front and back. So she's organically worked all of the context that you need into the text.
It's not the first time that it comes up during our literary translation roundtables. Translators and readers equally question the endnote versus footnote, and how should information be placed on the page visually. And so it's an interesting discussion in itself. And needless to say, we will be carrying the anthology at Globus Books. So if anyone is interested, please contact us, and we will be very honored to introduce you to this marvelous work. There was one more question for you, Boris.
Yes.
What was the practice of children's poetry in Russia like during the war?
Well, I'm not the right person to answer that question. That's definitely a question for Masha. And I'm sure she can answer it right now without much hesitation.
Well, so there was a glut of children's literature that was being produced during the war, because there was a huge demand for it. And a whole bunch of really good children's poetry was being written. So I also felt it had to be included, at least in some way, in the book. So Agnia Barto, who is, of course, she was a very interesting person. She was very committed to the regime, ultra loyal. Chukovsky, she was terrible to Chukovsky, and she felt that Chukovsky was somehow, going against the regime, and even though he really, mentored her and helped her out and so on. But she was a wonderful poet, a wonderful kids poet. And her poems, when they were read during the war, really felt like a breath of fresh air. Because she wrote about things, maybe she felt were, for children, but there are also things that everyone cared about, like getting a letter from someone you love, and, worrying, why is this letter not coming? So in the anthology, one of these poems is actually included.
Yeah, it's a wonderful poem called Natasha, and Masha has translated it very, very beautifully.
With help.
So I don't have many more questions. I think that the one question that I would like to ask both Masha and Irina, if they want to weigh in, but they're not obligated to do so, is what are the lessons that we can draw from the experience of these poets and from this collection for our current moment, or for any moment of crisis? Is there a lesson to draw?
Poetry helps you survive,
Mm.
whatever it is. You know, we see it again and again. Theodore Adorno said, you know, is it possible to write poetry after Auschwitz? It's barbaric. How could you do it? But I think we see it again and again, and we saw that, you know, with Lev Ozerov, where he wrote in the poem about Evgenia Taratuta, you know, when in one of the books that, you know, Boris and Robert sort of spearheaded.
And you and Adina, we all worked on it. It's
But there is this one poem where this woman poet was being tortured, and the way she survived, the way she didn't go insane, is she recited poems to herself. And so that's what you see again and again with anthology. I mean, one poet I should mention, Yuri Grunin. He was an artist. He was a poet. He was fighting. He was encircled. The Germans made him dig roads. He was part of the road building team. And it was terrible. They were building them in bogs, and people died all the time. They're drowning in the bogs. And so he wrote poetry to survive just that anguish of the, you know, the German, the Nazi camps. And then he was saved by Soviet troops. You know, he was taken back to the army, and then they discovered, oh, he was building roads for the enemy. Therefore, he collaborated. Therefore, he should be thrown into the Gulag, which he was. And so to survive the experience of the Gulag, he was again writing poetry, just to be able to somehow, you know, to make it psychologically, mentally. So I think if there's anything we can learn from all of this, is that during the worst times, the most difficult times, whatever they are, personally or, you know, socially or historically, poetry always helps.
If you could tell us a little bit more about some of the reactions that have greeted the book, that would be also very interesting. Have you had, I know Robert has been posting some of these poems individually online. I do think that this is a revelation for a lot of people, largely positive. I'm sure that there will be some pushback, but what has been the reaction so far to the poems that you've shared with people, Masha and Robert?
I've only shared the poems with my family and a couple of close friends, and they're all very supportive. They love it. My kids want me to start working on something happy. They've had enough of the war theme. You know, just generally, one thing I found, I knew that a lot of people won't be very happy by the, you know, the émigré poets and the poets who were, you know, for one reason or another associated with the Nazis. You know, either they were sort of on the territory the Nazis occupied and sort of left with them because they were afraid that they would be taken afterwards into these filtration camps, or who indeed collaborated in one particular case, at least, with the Nazi regime for various reasons. And so I knew that feelings would run high. And at one point, this very friendly editor of a Soviet poetry edition, war poem edition, when he found out which poems I'm including by you know, who the poets are, he actually just cut off correspondence with me entirely. And I was a bit taken aback, but really having thought about it, I'm not surprised. Feelings run very, very high, and it's you know, a lot of people, I'm sure, will not be thrilled that they're all together in one book. But I really think, you know, having done all of this and having discovered all of these poets for myself, I really think that there's a lot gained by having all these different perspectives on the war. And that it's not only, you know, for me, after doing this, it's not only a different understanding of war poetry that I have, but I think a different understanding of the war and what it was like and what it felt like for people who were in it. So that's what I can say about responses so far.
And I think, Robert, you found that the poems that you've posted to Facebook have met with universal praise.
Yes, absolutely. But a particular thing I'd just like to say is that Masha's putting these poets from different camps into the same book. It suddenly made me think of a a moment in Life and Fate, in Vasily Grossman's novel. But I think I've read similar stories elsewhere of, during one of the most terrible of all the terrible, endless artillery barrages, are a couple of men who, taking shelter in the same hole, and they actually they end up sort of holding hands, and only when finally the shooting dies down, it dawns on them that one is German and one is Russian. They sort of shamefacedly slip back to their respective trenches and sort of hope that no one notices that they've been in this hole with someone from the other side. So, that didn't change anything, but nevertheless it was a momentary revelation of shared humanity.
Yes.
And let's hope that Masha's anthologies are slightly, well, perhaps a great deal more lasting reminder of that shared humanity.
I would like to make a little overall note. This anthology, as you were talking about it, reminded me of a childhood memory of visiting the monastery in Valaam Island. And for those who are not familiar with history, there was a place where the Soviet government would ship all the invalids. So the place was a grotesque space filled with people maimed, people who literally had no arms, no legs. It was for a little child that I was, that was a monstrous impression. But my parents took it to heart to take me there and to show how it really was. So I didn't risk glamorizing the war. And at the time that we're living now, I think these experiences and such an anthology is especially important because we are dealing now with often history being laundered and weaponized and narratives being flipped, and the victorious war becoming a brand. And bringing back voices like this that were mute and unheard, with all the, grossness of it, the way you read today, the way everyone here presented the real poems, the real meat and grit of it, is as critical as it possible to be, because otherwise, and that I want to finish it with, my favorite quote from Andrei Tarkovsky is that the past is chasing us like a madman with a razor in the hand. And just turning back and looking this past in the face and hearing their voices, we have a chance of stopping this past, unmaddening it, and seeing it for what it was. And for that, I really want to thank you.
Thank you, Zarina. That was very beautifully put and very important context for the book. Congratulations on your major victory on this day of invasion, Masha. I hope this book invades a lot of houses at some point.
Thank you.
There's so many projects right now that are so hastily put together. And there is so much haste in general in our life. These three people are my, not only are they dear friends and collaborators and lifeline. Every day I learn from them on so many levels and so many things. But there is one thing that I want to just emphasize today: the class of work, the work ethics and class by which everything Robert and Maria and Boris is marked. Everything they do is marked with thoroughness and accuracy, and just I can't imagine how the scope and the scale of this work, this anthology, it's just unbelievable. And it was done by pretty much one person. It's a one woman endeavor, and it's just, I'm in awe. And I will be learning more, and I will be looking up to you guys, to the way you work.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for all your help. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for providing this opportunity. So it's been a great joy to be introduced to them in such an enjoyable way and with old and close friends. So thank you very much, all of you. It's great to see.
Thank you, my dear friends, Maria and, well, like Masha, let's face it, and Ira. And thank you all for joining us out there.